The winter of 1858 brought more than snow to the Virginia mountains. It brought desperation thick as the ice that coated every branch, every blade of grass, every breath that escaped trembling lips. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across the valley like a scar, its white columns gleaming against the gray sky, beautiful from a distance, but hiding ugliness within its walls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Celeste pressed her swollen belly against the rough wooden slats of the slave quarters, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the boards. At 19, she carried twins that kicked and moved inside her like they were already trying to escape this place. Her dark skin bore the marks of a hard life, but her eyes held something that couldn't be beaten out of her. Hope. The overseer's boots had echoed across the yard earlier that evening, and Celeste knew what they meant. Master Whitmore had been drinking again, and when he drank, his eyes wandered to the women's quarters. She'd seen what happened to the others. She'd heard their cries in the night, but she wouldn't let it happen to her children. Not while they still grew inside her. Not while she still had strength to run. The other women slept fitfully around her, their breathing creating small clouds in the frozen air. Old Mama Ruth wheezed in the corner, her arthritis making every movement painful. Young Susanna curled up with her baby, both of them sharing thin blankets that did little against the cold. These women had become her family, but tonight, Celeste would have to leave them behind. She'd been planning this escape for weeks, ever since she'd overheard Master Whitmore talking to his wife about selling her babies once they were born. The thought made her sick, but it also made her determined. She'd gathered scraps of food, hidden them in a cloth bundle. She'd memorized the paths through the woods, the ones the hunting dogs rarely used. She'd waited for a night when the snow would cover her tracks and the wind would scatter her scent. Tonight was that night. Celeste rose slowly, careful not to wake the others. Her body ached with the weight of her pregnancy, but she forced herself to move. She pulled on every piece of clothing she owned, a torn dress, a threadbare shawl, boots with holes that would let in the snow. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The bundle of food felt impossibly small in her hands. A few pieces of hardtack, some dried corn, a small bottle of water that would likely freeze before morning. She tucked it close to her body, hoping her warmth would keep it from turning to ice. The door to the quarters creaked as she opened it, and she froze, heart hammering. But no one stirred. The wind was too loud, the night too cold for anyone to be paying attention to small sounds. She slipped outside, bare feet hitting the snow-covered ground. The cold hit her like a physical blow. It cut through her thin clothes and wrapped around her bones, making her teeth chatter immediately. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't hesitate. Every second she stood still was a second closer to being discovered. The main house loomed ahead of her, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. She could see shadows moving inside, the Whitmore family, safe and warm while their slaves froze in the quarters. The sight filled her with a rage that kept her moving forward, step by painful step through the snow. She skirted the edge of the yard, staying in the shadows of the outbuildings. The barn, the smokehouse, the chicken coop, all familiar landmarks that she was seeing for the last time. Behind the barn, the woods began, dark and endless and full of dangers she couldn't imagine. But whatever waited in those trees couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. The snow crunched under her feet, each step sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. She prayed the wind would muffle the sound, would hide her passage until she was far enough away that it wouldn't matter. Her belly cramped with each step, the babies inside her protesting this sudden activity. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The tree line appeared ahead of her like a dark wall. Once she crossed it, there would be no going back. She'd be a runaway slave hunted by dogs and men with guns. If they caught her, the punishment would be worse than death. But if she didn't try, her children would grow up in chains, and that was a fate she couldn't accept. She plunged into the woods, branches catching at her clothes and scratching her face. The snow was deeper here, coming up to her knees in some places. Each step required enormous effort, and she could feel her strength draining away. But she pushed forward, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the bare branches. The trees seemed to close in around her as she walked deeper into the forest. Every shadow looked like a pursuer, every sound like baying hounds. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, her breath coming in short gasps that turned to ice crystals in the air. Hours passed, or maybe minutes' time became meaningless. In the endless white wilderness, her feet had long since gone numb, and she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. The babies inside her had gone quiet, as if they too sensed the danger they were in. She talked to them as she walked, whispering promises about the life they'd have once they were free. "We're going to make it," she told them, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We're going to find somewhere safe, somewhere warm. You'll never know what it's like to be owned by anyone." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her heart. The cold was getting worse, and she was getting weaker. The small bundle of food seemed inadequate against the vast hunger that was growing in her belly. The thin clothes were no match for the bitter wind that cut through the trees like knives. She stumbled over a fallen branch hidden in the snow and fell hard, landing on her hands and knees. The impact sent a sharp pain through her belly, and she gasped, staying still for a moment to make sure the babies were all right. They kicked weakly, as if reassuring her that they were still there, still fighting. Getting back to her feet took more effort than she'd expected. Her legs shook and black spots danced at the edges of her vision. But she stood, brushed the snow from her clothes, and kept walking. There was no other choice. The landscape around her was alien and hostile. These weren't the gentle hills near the plantation, where she'd at least known which plants were edible and where the streams ran. This was a wild country, mountainous and unforgiving. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwined overhead like the bars of a prison. The snow fell heavier, making it harder to see more than a few feet in any direction. She had no idea where she was going. North, she thought, toward the free state she'd heard whispered about in the slave quarters. But the mountains made it impossible to know which direction was which. Every path looked the same, every tree identical to the last. She was lost, and she knew it, but she kept walking because stopping meant dying. The night stretched on endlessly. Her water bottle had frozen solid, and she supped on pieces of ice to keep her mouth from drying out completely. The hardtack was like chewing on wood, but she forced herself to eat small pieces, knowing she needed the strength even though her stomach rebelled against the meager food. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The baying of hounds. They discovered her absence. They were already on her trail. The snow that she'd hoped would hide her tracks had stopped falling, and now her footprints led straight to where she stood. Panic gave her new energy, and she began to run, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth. Branches tore at her clothes and her face, but she didn't care. She could hear the dogs getting closer, their howls echoing off the mountains. Behind them would be men with guns and whips, men who would drag her back to face punishment she couldn't imagine. But running in her condition was impossible. After only a few minutes, her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She collapsed against a large oak tree, gasping for breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The babies inside her kicked frantically, disturbed by her terror and exhaustion. The sound of the dogs grew louder, closer. She could hear men's voices now, calling to each other through the trees. They were following her trail, and it was only a matter of time before they found her. Unless she could find somewhere to hide, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. She forced herself to her feet and kept moving. but more slowly now, trying to conserve what little strength she had left. The terrain was getting rougher, more rocky, and the trees were thinning out. She was climbing now, ascending into the higher elevations where the air was thinner and the cold more brutal. A cliff face appeared ahead of her, rising straight up into the darkness. For a moment, despair overwhelmed her. This was the end. She couldn't climb, couldn't go around, couldn't go back. But then she noticed something, a dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by hanging icicles. A cave dot she stumbled toward. Praying it was deep enough to hide in, praying it wasn't already occupied by bears or other dangerous animals. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for her swollen body, but she squeezed through ice-cold water dripping on her head. As she pushed past the icicles, inside the cave was pitch black and deadly silent. She felt around with her hands, trying to determine how deep it went, how safe it might be. The floor was rocky but dry, and she could feel no wind moving through the space. It would have to do. She crawled as far back into the cave as she could, until her outstretched hands touched the back wall. Then she curled up in the darkness, wrapping her shawl around her as tightly as possible, trying to conserve what little body heat she had left. The sound of the dogs was fainter now, but still audible. They were searching, but the rocky terrain and the cave's hidden entrance might be enough to fool them. She held her breath as the sounds came closer, then gradually began to fade as the search party moved on. But even though she'd escaped immediate capture, her situation was desperate. The cave was dry, but it was also freezing. She had almost no food left, no water except what she could melt from snow, and no way to make a fire without giving away her position. The babies inside her were moving less frequently now, and she, worried that the cold and stress were affecting them, she spent the rest of the night huddled in that cave, drifting in and out of a fitful sleep plagued by nightmares of recapture and punishment. When dawn finally came, filtering weakly through the cave entrance, she felt weaker than ever. Her body ached from the cold and the hard stone floor, and every movement sent sharp pains through her swollen belly. But she was alive. She was free, and her children were still safe inside her. She crawled to the cave entrance and peered out cautiously. The world outside was a pristine white wilderness, beautiful and deadly. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear blue sky, and air so cold it hurt to breathe. There was no sign of her pursuers, but she knew they hadn't given up. They'd be back with more men, more dogs, more determination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She needed to keep moving, but she also needed to rest. The babies were due soon. She could feel it in the way they'd positioned themselves, the way her body was preparing for their arrival. She might have days, or she might have hours. Either way, she needed to find better shelter, warmer clothes, food that would sustain her through childbirth. The cave had saved her life, but it couldn't be her permanent refuge. She gathered what little strength she had left and prepared to venture back into the wilderness. Somewhere in these mountains there had to be help. There had to be someone who would take pity on a pregnant woman fleeing slavery. She didn't know that 20 miles away, a man named Ezra Blackwood was checking his trap lines, moving through the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there. She didn't know that he lived alone in a cabin built with his own hands, that he'd left civilization behind years ago, seeking solitude and peace. She didn't know that their paths were about to cross in a way that would change both their lives forever. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, keep hoping, keep believing that freedom was possible. For herself, and for the 2 lives she carried within her, Ezra Blackwood had learned to read the mountains the way other men read books. Every broken branch, every disturbed patch of snow, every unusual track told a story. This morning, as he made his way along the ridge checking beaver traps, the forest was telling him something he'd never heard before. The trapline wound through territory he'd claimed as his own 5 years ago, when the weight of civilization had grown too heavy for his shoulders. He'd been a different man then. Ezra Whitfield, store clerk in Richmond. Pressed clothes and polished shoes, dreams of a wife and children, and a house with white picket fences. But war had a way of changing dreams into nightmares, and when he returned from Mexico, the man who came back bore little resemblance to the one who'd left. The mountains had healed him, slowly and without judgment. Here, among the towering pines and granite peaks, he'd found something resembling peace. His cabin sat in a hidden valley, accessible only by paths he'd carved himself, stocked with everything a man needed to survive: dried meat, preserved vegetables. From his garden, medical supplies he'd learned to use through necessity and trial. But this morning, the wilderness was speaking a different language. The first sign had been the ravens. Instead of their usual lazy circles, they flew in agitated patterns, calling to each other with harsh cries that echoed off the canyon walls. Animals fled in directions that made no sense: deer heading uphill instead of down to water, rabbits breaking cover in broad daylight. Something had disturbed the natural order, and Ezra's instincts, honed by years of mountain living, told him it was human. He crouched beside a stream, examining tracks in the muddy bank. Boot prints, but not the heavy, confident stride of hunters or trappers. These were smaller, lighter, and they wandered as if the person making them had no clear destination. More troubling, they were accompanied by drops of what looked like blood, dark stains that stood out against the pristine snow. Ezra straightened, his weathered face creased with concern. In 5 years of solitude, he'd encountered maybe a dozen other souls in these mountains, and most of them had been passing through on their way to somewhere else. Someone was out here, hurt and lost, and the temperature was dropping again. Another storm was building on the horizon, visible as a dark line of clouds moving in from the west. He abandoned his trapline and began following the tracks, moving with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to dangerous terrain. The trail led higher into the mountains, toward the rocky outcroppings where caves provided shelter, but temperatures dropped even further. Whoever he was following was either very brave or very desperate. The tracks grew more erratic as he climbed, with longer gaps between footprints where the person had clearly stumbled or fallen. There were signs of rest stops, places where someone had sat in the snow for extended periods, and the blood drops were becoming more frequent. Ezra's jaw tightened as he recognized the signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. A sound drifted down. From above, not human, but the distinctive baying of hounds. Search dogs, still distant but getting closer. Ezra paused, considering. If there were dogs, there were men behind them, and men with dogs in these mountains usually meant one thing: a hunt for a runaway slave. He'd encountered such searches before, and they always left him with a bitter taste. Men pursuing other human beings like animals, treating people as property to be recovered. It went against everything he believed, everything he'd fought for in Mexico, when he'd still thought wars could be fought for righteous causes. The decision formed in his mind without conscious thought. He would find this person first, before the dogs did. Whatever their story, whatever they'd done, they deserved better than being torn apart by hounds in a frozen wilderness. The trail led to a sheer rock face, and for a moment Ezra thought he'd lost it. But his experienced eye caught something the pursuing men would likely miss: a narrow opening in the stone, partially concealed by hanging icicles. The tracks led directly to it. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle whoever might be hiding inside. The cave mouth was barely wide enough for a person, and completely invisible unless you were looking for it. Perfect for hiding, but also a potential trap if someone was desperate enough to fight rather than surrender. "Hello," he called softly, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "I'm not here to hurt you. I live in these mountains. I can help." Silence, stretched for long moments, broken only by the distant sound of the search dogs. Then, from deep within the cave, came a voice so weak he almost missed it. Double quotes, please. Don't tell them where I am. It was a woman's voice, young and frightened, with the distinct accent of the Virginia lowlands. Ezra's heart clenched as he realized what he was dealing with. A young woman, alone in the wilderness, being hunted by men with dogs. The pieces of the story were coming together, and none of them were good. I won't tell anyone, he said, crouching by the cave entrance. But you can't stay here. There's another storm coming, and those dogs will find you eventually. I have a cabin, warm and safe. Will you let me help you? Another long silence, then. You're not with them? No, ma'am, I live alone up here. Have for 5 years. I don't much care for the company of men who hunt other people. A rustling sound from within the cave, then the scrape of movement on stone. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, and Ezra's breath caught in his throat. She was younger than he'd expected, probably no more than 20, with dark skin that spoke of African heritage and eyes that held more pain than any person her age should carry. But what truly shocked him was her condition. She was heavily pregnant, so far along that she looked ready to give birth at any moment. Her clothes were little more than rags, soaked through and offering no protection against the cold. Her lips were blue with hypothermia, and she shook uncontrollably as she tried to stand. One look told him she was closer to death than life, surviving on will alone. My God, he breathed, then moved forward without thinking. Here, let me help you. She flinched away from his outstretched hand, and he stopped immediately, understanding. She had no reason to trust any man, especially a white man she'd never seen before. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. My name is Ezra, he said gently, staying where he was. Ezra Blackwood. I used to live down in Richmond, but I came up here to get away from people mostly. I have a cabin about 2 miles from here, with a warm fire and food and clean clothes. You look like you need all 3. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden threats. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded slowly. Celeste, she whispered. My name is Celeste. Nice to meet you, Celeste. Now we need to get you out of here before those dogs get any closer. Can you walk? She tried to take a step and nearly collapsed. Ezra caught her before she could fall, feeling how cold her skin was through the thin fabric of her dress. She was burning what remained of her body's reserves just to stay alive, and those reserves were almost gone. I'm going to carry you, he said matter-of-factly. It's the only way we'll make it to my cabin before dark. Before she could protest, he lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was despite her pregnancy. She was literally wasting away, her body consuming itself to keep the babies alive. He needed to get food and warmth into her quickly, or both she and her children would die. The journey to his cabin was treacherous under the best circumstances, but carrying a pregnant woman while navigating icy trails and avoiding search parties added layers of difficulty Ezra had never faced. He moved as quickly as he dared, following paths known only to him, taking routes that would confuse the dogs and lead any pursuers away from his valley. Celeste drifted in and out of consciousness during the trip, her body finally allowing itself to rest, now that someone else was taking care of her survival. In her delirium, she mumbled about her babies, about masters and overseers, about freedom. That seemed always just out of reach. The cabin appeared through the trees like a beacon of hope. Ezra had built it himself, using techniques learned from an old trapper who'd befriended him during his first winter in the mountains. It was solid, well-insulated, and designed to keep a person alive through the worst weather the region could produce. He kicked the door open and carried Celeste straight to the bed, laying her gently on the thick quilts his grandmother had made years before. The cabin was cold. He'd been gone since dawn, but the fireplace was laid and ready. Within minutes, flames were crackling and warmth began to spread through the single room, Celeste's eyes fluttered open as the heat reached her, and she tried to sit up. "Easy," Ezra said, pressing her gently back down. "You're safe now. This is my home, and nobody's going to hurt you here." She looked around the cabin with wide eyes, taking in the rough-hewn furniture, the shelves lined with books and medical supplies, the kitchen area with its cast-iron stove and well-stocked pantries. It was simple but comfortable, the home of a man who'd learned to take care of himself. "I need to check on those babies," Ezra said, rolling up his sleeves. "I'm not a doctor, but I've delivered foals and calves. The principles are probably similar." Fear flashed across Celeste's face. "They're not due yet," she said quickly. "I still have time." But even as she spoke, a contraction gripped her, and she gasped, her hands flying to her swollen belly. Ezra saw the truth in her expression. The babies were coming, ready or not. "All right," he said calmly, moving to the medical supplies he kept in a wooden chest. "Let's get you more comfortable, and then we'll see what these little ones have to say about their timing." Over the next hour, he worked with quiet efficiency, helping Celeste out of her wet clothes and into one of his clean shirts, building up the fire until the cabin was warm as summer, preparing clean towels and hot water. She watched him move around the space with obvious skill, and gradually the tension in her shoulders began to ease. "Why are you helping me?" she asked during a lull between contractions. Ezra paused in his preparations, considering the question. "I suppose because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "I've seen enough cruelty in my life. When I have a chance to show kindness instead, I try to take it. But She began, then stopped, uncertain how to finish. "You're a human being in need of help," Ezra said firmly. "That's all that matters to me." Outside, the wind was picking up again, and snow began to fall past the cabin's windows. The storm he'd predicted was arriving, which meant the search parties would have to take shelter or risk getting lost themselves. For the moment, at least, they were safe. The contractions were getting stronger and closer together. Ezra had seen enough births among his animals to recognize the signs. These babies were definitely coming tonight. He prepared everything he could think of, then sat beside the bed to wait. "Tell me about them," he said, nodding toward her belly. "The babies." A smile crossed Celeste's face for the first time since he'd found her. "Twins," she said softly. "They move so much, especially at night. Like they're dancing together in there. Do you have names picked out?" "Hope," she said without hesitation. "For the girl, because that's what kept me going. And for the boy, ... double quotes," she paused, considering. "Freedom, because that's what I want him to have." Ezra nodded, understanding. These weren't just babies to her. They were the future, the promise of something better than the life she'd known. No wonder she'd risked everything to escape. The labor intensified as the night wore on, and Ezra found himself coaching Celeste through each contraction, offering what comfort and encouragement he could. She was incredibly strong, bearing the pain with a stoicism that spoke of a life filled with hardship, but she was also exhausted and malnourished. As dawn approached, the first baby finally made her appearance, a tiny girl with her mother's dark eyes and a voice that filled the cabin with indignant cries. Ezra cleaned her carefully and placed her on Celeste's chest, watching tears of joy stream down the new mother's face. "Hope," Celeste whispered, stroking the baby's wet hair. "My beautiful Hope." The second baby, a boy, followed an hour later. Smaller than his sister, but equally vocal about his arrival in the world. Ezra wrapped him in a clean towel and handed him to Celeste, who cradled both children against her chest with an expression of pure love. "Freedom," she murmured. "You made it, my brave boy. You're both free." As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, Ezra looked at the woman and children who had stumbled into his solitary life. He'd thought he was done with caring about other people, done with the complications that came with human connection. But as he watched Celeste sing softly to her newborn twins, he realized that sometimes fate had other plans. Sometimes the wilderness brought you exactly what you didn't know you needed. Outside, the storm was finally passing, but the real changes were just beginning. The first week in Ezra's cabin passed like a dream wrapped in mountain mist. Celeste found herself in a world she'd never imagined possible, a place where she woke each morning without fear, where her children's cries were met with gentle hands and soft words instead of curses and threats. The babies thrived in the warmth and security, growing stronger each day under Ezra's careful attention and her own devoted care. Ezra moved through his daily routines with quiet efficiency, but everything had changed. The solitary rhythms he'd established over 5 years now revolved around feedings and diaper changes, around the soft sounds of lullabies and the gentle breathing of sleeping infants. He'd fashioned cribs from wooden crates, lined them with the softest furs he possessed, and positioned them near the fireplace where the warmth would keep the babies comfortable. Celeste watched him work with wonder growing in her heart. She'd never seen a man handle children with such natural tenderness. On the plantation, men were distant figures who barked orders and wielded whips. But Ezra spoke to hope and freedom, as if they were already people with thoughts and feelings worth considering, not just burdens to be endured. "You're spoiling them," she said one afternoon, watching him rock little Hope to sleep while Freedom dozed in his makeshift crib. "Can't spoil a baby," Ezra replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They only know love or fear at this age. I figure they've had enough fear to last several lifetimes." The observation hit deeper than he'd intended, and Celeste felt tears prick her eyes. He was right, of course. These children had been born into a world that would have seen them as property, their lives measured only by the labor they could eventually provide. Here, in this mountain sanctuary, they were simply themselves, precious, perfect, loved, but love couldn't keep the reality of their situation at bay forever. On the 8th day, as Celeste was nursing Freedom by the fire, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. Ezra's entire body went rigid, and he moved swiftly to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "How many?" Celeste whispered, clutching the baby tighter to her chest. "3 riders," Ezra said grimly. "2 well-dressed to be trappers. 2 determined to be lost." He turned from the window, his face set in hard lines. "They found us." Panic rose in Celeste's throat, but before it could overwhelm her, Ezra was at her side, his hands steady on her shoulders. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. It's hidden, warm, and stocked with supplies. Take the babies down there and don't come out until I give you the all clear. No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes. What about you?" she asked, fear making her voice shake. "I'll handle them. I've been dealing with unwelcome visitors for years." His smile was grim but reassuring. "Trust me, Celeste. I won't let them take you." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist they flee together into the wilderness. But the babies were too young for such a journey, and she knew Ezra was right. The root cellar was their best chance. He showed her the hidden entrance, a section of floorboards that lifted away to reveal a ladder leading down into darkness. The space below was larger than she'd expected, carved directly into the mountainside, and lined with stone. Shelves held preserves and dried goods, and several oil lamps provided warm light. It was clearly a place Ezra had prepared for exactly this situation. As she settled the babies on a pile of soft blankets, she could hear the horses stopping outside the cabin. Voices carried through the thin mountain air, and she recognized the cultured tones of educated men. Slave catchers, then, not the rough bounty hunters she'd feared. These would be worse in their own way, men who saw her capture as a business transaction, who would discuss her fate with the same detachment they'd used to negotiate the price of livestock. Ezra's voice drifted down through the floorboards as he opened the cabin door. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "You're a long way from civilization. Something I can help you with? Mr. Blackwood, I presume?" The speaker had a Virginia accent, smooth and confident. "I'm Samuel Crawford, attorney for the Whitmore estate. These are my associates, Mr. Dalton and Mr. Pierce." "Attorney," Ezra repeated. "That's a fancy word for it. Most men would just say bounty hunter." "We're here on legitimate business," Crawford continued, ignoring the barb. "We're seeking a runaway slave named Celeste, believed to be traveling with stolen property belonging to my client. We have reason to believe she may have passed through this area." "Lot of people pass through these mountains," Ezra said carefully. "Can't say I pay much attention to them. Perhaps this will refresh your memory." Paper rustled. "A wanted poster, most likely. Young woman, African features, approximately 19 years of age. She was pregnant when she fled, which means she may have given birth by now. The children, of course, are also property of the Whitmore estate." The casual way he spoke of human beings as property made Celeste's blood boil. Below in the cellar, she held her babies closer, as if her arms alone could shield them from a world that saw them as commodities. "Afraid I can't help you," Ezra said, and she could hear the steel beneath his polite tone. "Like I said, I don't pay much attention to travelers. Mr. Blackwood," Crawford's voice hardened, "I should mention that harboring fugitive slaves is a federal crime. The penalties are quite severe." "And I should mention," Ezra replied evenly, "that trespassing on a man's property is also against the law. You've stated your business. Now I suggest you state your departure." A long silence stretched above, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the whisper of wind through the pines. Celeste could picture the scene. 3 well-dressed men confronting one mountain hermit, confident in their legal authority and social position. They had no idea what kind of man they were dealing with. "We have the right to search these premises," Crawford said finally. "You have warrants?" Ezra's voice was deceptively calm. "We don't need warrants for fugitive slaves." "You do on my land." The temperature in Ezra's voice dropped several degrees. "And unless you'd like to explain to the territorial marshal why you drew weapons on a law-abiding citizen, I suggest you reconsider your approach." More silence, then the sound of horses moving. But they weren't leaving. They were spreading out, surrounding the cabin. Celeste's heart raced as she realized what was happening. They intended to search whether Ezra consented or not. "Mr. Dalton," Crawford called out, "check the barn and outbuildings. Mr. Pierce, circle around back. Look for signs of recent activity, birth blood, baby clothes, anything that suggests she's been here." Celeste bit her lip to keep from crying out. Of course there would be signs. Ezra had burned her bloody clothes and buried the afterbirth, but traces would remain. These men knew what to look for. Above, she heard Ezra's boots moving across the floor, heading toward what she knew was his gun cabinet. The click of a rifle being loaded echoed through the cabin. "Gentlemen," Ezra called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I've been polite because I believe in civilized discourse. But you're about to cross a line that can't be uncrossed. Leave now, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." "Are you threatening officers of the law?" Crawford demanded. "I'm informing trespassers that they're no longer welcome on my property." The sound of breaking glass came from the back of the cabin. One of them was forcing entry through a window. Celeste pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle her breathing, knowing that discovery now would mean death, or worse for all of them. "Mr. Pierce," Crawford shouted, "report. Found something." Came the reply from inside the cabin. "Recent birth, by the look of it. Whoever was here, they had those babies recently." Celeste's heart sank. They knew. It was only a matter of time before they found the hidden entrance to the cellar. "Bring her out, Blackwood," Crawford called. "We know she's here. Make this easy on yourself." Only thing I'm going to make easy, Ezra replied, is your trip back down the mountain. You've got 10 seconds to start moving. You're outnumbered 3-1. Then I guess you'd better hope you're faster than my rifle. The standoff stretched for long moments, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Then, Pierce's voice came again from inside the cabin, closer now to the kitchen area. Crawford, there's something strange about this floor. Some of these boards look loose. This was it. In moments, they'd discover the hidden entrance. Celeste gathered her babies closer, whispering silent prayers to any god who might be listening. If they were found, she'd face punishment beyond imagining. But worse than her own fate would be watching her children grow up in chains, their spirits broken before they were old enough to remember freedom. The sound of splintering wood came from above. Pierce was prying up the floorboards. Any second now he'd find the entrance. Then the world exploded into violence. Ezra's rifle boomed, followed immediately by a scream of pain. Horses whinnied and reared as their riders shouted orders. More gunshots echoed across the valley, some from inside the cabin, others from the yard. "Pierce is down," someone yelled. "Son of a bitch shot him." "Take him alive." Crawford's voice was strained with fury. "We need to know where she is." The battle raged above Celeste's head, the sound of running feet and crashing furniture mixing with the sharp crack of gunfire. She huddled in the darkness, trying to shield her babies from the noise while terror consumed her heart. Then, suddenly, silence out stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. No voices, no movement, just the whisper of wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Celeste waited, barely breathing, clutching hope and freedom to her chest. Finally, Ezra's voice drifted down through the floorboards. "Celeste? It's safe now, you can come up." But she hesitated. What if they'd captured him, forced him to call her out? What if this was a trap? "Celeste," his voice came again, gentler this time. "I know you're scared, but I promise you, they're gone. It's just us now." Something in his tone convinced her. She gathered the babies and climbed the ladder, emerging into a cabin that looked like a battlefield. Furniture was overturned, windows were broken, and bullet holes starred the walls. But Ezra stood in the center of it all, alive and unharmed, his rifle still smoking in his hands. "Are they?" she began. "Pierce is wounded, but alive. The other two carried him out. They won't be back anytime soon." He set the rifle aside and moved to help her with the babies. "But word will spread. There'll be others." The reality of their situation settled over her like a weight. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. As long as she remained in Virginia, in the United States, she'd be a fugitive. Her children would never be safe. "There's something I need to tell you," Ezra said, his voice careful. "About where we go from here." She looked at him expectantly, seeing something new in his expression, determination, mixed with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "I know people," he continued. "People who help folks like you reach places where the law can't touch them. It's dangerous, and it's a long journey, but it's possible." "You mean ... double quotes she hardly dared to hope. "I mean real freedom, Celeste. For you and the babies. A place where nobody owns anybody else, where your children can grow up truly free." The promise hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Freedom, not just the desperate flight she'd been attempting, but genuine liberty, the kind she'd only dreamed of in her darkest moments. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you risk so much for us?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had been his sanctuary for so long. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Because some things are worth risking everything for. And looking at you, at them ... He gestured toward the babies sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around them. "I think I'm finally ready to remember what those things are." That night, As they cleaned up the cabin and planned their next move, Celeste felt something shift. In her heart, the man who'd saved her life, who'd delivered her children and defended them with his own blood, was offering her something beyond rescue. He was offering her a future. And for the first time since she'd fled into the snow, she dared to believe that the future might actually be possible. The preparation took 3 days, and each hour that passed felt borrowed from fate itself. Ezra worked with the methodical precision of a man who understood that a single oversight could mean death for everyone he'd come to care about. He cleaned and oiled every weapon in his possession, packed medicines and survival gear with military efficiency, and drew detailed maps on pieces of bark showing routes through the wilderness that existed only in his memory. Celeste spent those days learning to be a mother while preparing to become a fugitive again. The twins were growing stronger, but they were still so small, so vulnerable. Hope had developed the habit of gripping Celeste's finger with surprising strength, as if she already understood the importance of holding on. Freedom slept more peacefully than his sister, but when he was awake, his dark eyes seemed to take in everything around him with an alertness that was almost unsettling in one so young. On the evening of the second day, as Celeste was bundling the few possessions they could carry, she found Ezra sitting by the fire with a worn leather journal in his hands. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, sketches of plants and animals, observations about weather patterns and seasonal changes. It was the record of his years in the mountains, the accumulated wisdom of a man who'd learned to read the wilderness like scripture. "You're documenting everything," she observed, settling beside him with freedom nursing at her breast. "Someone should know," he said simply. "This place, these trails, the safe spots and the dangerous ones. If something happens to me, you'll need to know how to survive out there." The casual mention of his possible death made her stomach clench. "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said fiercely. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe. "Uncertainties, maybe not. But we'd be fools not to prepare for it." Over the next hour, he showed her the journal's contents. Maps drawn from memory, marking water sources and caves, noting which plants were edible and which were poison, describing the habits of dangerous animals and the signs of approaching storms. It was a survival manual written in the margins of lived experience. "The Underground Railroad," he said, pointing to a series of coded symbols scattered across his maps, "isn't what most people think. It's not a single route or a formal organization. It's a network of individuals, each one knowing only their small piece of the puzzle. That way, if someone's captured, they can't reveal the whole system." He traced a path with his finger, winding through mountain passes and river valleys. "Our first stop is with a family called the Hendersons. Samuel Henderson runs a grain mill about 40 miles north of here. He and his wife Mary have been helping people find freedom for over a decade. They'll know the next link in the chain. And if they've been discovered, if they're no longer safe, then we keep moving until we find someone who is." His voice was calm, but she could see the worry in the set of his shoulders. "That's how it works, Celeste. One step at a time, one safe house to the next, until you reach a place where the hunters can't follow." The third day brought visitors of a different sort. Celeste was feeding hope when she heard voices outside, not the harsh commands of slave catchers, but the cheerful greetings of neighbors. Ezra's body language changed immediately, tension flowing out of his shoulders as he recognized the arrivals. "Jonas," he called out, opening the cabin door to reveal an elderly man with a magnificent white beard and a woman who could only be his wife. "Martha, what brings you up here?" "Heard you had some excitement a few days back," Jonas replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Thought we'd stop by and see if you needed any help cleaning up." Martha pushed past her husband with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman accustomed to taking charge. "More importantly," she said, her gaze falling on Celeste and the babies, We heard you had new additions to your household. These were the Weatherbys, Ezra explained as he made introductions. They lived in a valley 10 miles south, close enough to be neighbors by mountain standards, far enough away to maintain privacy. Jonas trapped and hunted for a living, while Martha was known throughout the region as a skilled healer and midwife. "Let me see those babies," Martha demanded, but her voice was gentle as she approached. "Been delivering children in these mountains for 30 years. Want to make sure they're thriving." As Martha examined hope and freedom with expert hands, Jonas spoke quietly with Ezra by the fireplace. Celeste couldn't hear their words, but she could see the concern in both men's faces. Whatever news Jonas had brought, it wasn't good. "Healthy as young bears," Martha announced with satisfaction. "You've done good work, Ezra. Not easy delivering twins, especially under difficult circumstances." "Martha," Celeste began hesitantly, do you know about— why are you here, about what you're running from?" Martha's smile was warm and understanding. "Child, I've been helping people find their way to freedom since before you were born. The details don't matter. What matters is getting you and these babies somewhere safe." Relief flooded through Celeste like warm water. Here was another ally, another person willing to risk everything to help strangers find freedom. It seemed impossible that such people existed, yet here they were, matter-of-factly discussing plans to defy federal law, as if they were organizing a church social. Jonas and Ezra joined them, their expressions serious. "There's been developments," Jonas said without preamble. "Word spread about the shooting. They're calling in federal marshals, offering rewards that have every bounty hunter from here to Richmond interested." "How much time do we have?" Ezra asked. "Not much. Day or two at most before this valley's crawling with searchers." "They know you're involved now, Ezra. Your solitary days are over." The weight of that statement settled over the cabin like smoke. Ezra had sacrificed more than Celeste had realized, not just his safety, but his entire way of life. The sanctuary he'd built in these mountains was gone forever. "I have wagons," Martha said suddenly, "and women's clothes that might fit you, Celeste. If we're smart about this, we can get you out tonight, before the net closes completely." "What about Ezra?" Celeste asked, surprising herself with the intensity of her concern. "I'll follow later," he said. "Different route, different timing. They'll be watching for a man traveling with a woman and babies. If we separate, we double our chances." Every instinct screamed against the idea of separating. These past days in the cabin had created bonds stronger than blood, and the thought of facing the wilderness without Ezra felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. But she could see the logic in his plan, even as her heart rebelled against it. "The Henderson Mill," Martha said, nodding. "Good choice for a first stop. Samuel's got hiding places that have fooled searchers for years. If anyone can keep you safe while Ezra catches up, it's them." They spent the afternoon in frantic preparation. Martha produced a traveling dress that fit Celeste reasonably well, along with a bonnet that would help disguise her features. Jonas shared intelligence about patrol routes and checkpoints, marking areas to avoid on Ezra's hand-drawn maps. As evening approached, the cabin filled with a strange mixture of urgency and melancholy. This place had been their sanctuary, their refuge from a hostile world. Leaving it felt like abandoning home, even though Celeste had only been there for 10 days. "I want you to have this," Ezra said, pressing his leather journal into her hands. "Everything I know about surviving in these mountains is in there. Routes, resources, people who can be trusted. If we get separated—" "We won't," she said firmly, but she took the journal anyway, understanding its importance. The wagon arrived just after sunset, a sturdy farm cart, loaded with grain sacks and pulled by 2 patient mules. Martha had arranged the cargo to create a hidden compartment just large enough for a woman and 2 babies, disguised so well that even careful inspection might miss it. Uncomfortable but safe, Jonas explained as he showed Celeste the hiding space. Martha's made this trip before. She knows what she's doing. As they prepared to leave, Ezra pulled Celeste aside for a private word. The babies were sleeping in their makeshift cradles, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change again. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice unusually formal. "About why I'm doing this. You already told me." "Because it's the right thing to do. That's part of it. But there's more." He struggled with the words, as if speaking them aloud would make them too real. "I care about you, Celeste, you and the babies. More than I expected, more than I probably should." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Celeste felt her heart race, not with fear this time, but with something else entirely. "I care about you too," she whispered. "But Ezra, even if we make it to freedom, even if we both survive this, I don't know what kind of future we could have together." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I'd like the chance to find out." Before she could respond, Martha called out that it was time to leave. The moment passed, but the words lingered, adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The goodbye was quick and practical. Anything else would have been too painful. Ezra helped Celeste into the hidden compartment with the babies, making sure they had everything they needed for the journey. His hands lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. 3 days, he said. "I'll meet you at the Henderson mill in 3 days. Promise me," she said, urgently. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he replied. But they both knew how little such promises meant in a world where people could disappear without a trace. The wagon lurched into motion, and Celeste found herself in darkness, holding her children close as they began the next phase of their journey toward freedom. Through gaps in the boards, she could see stars appearing in the clear mountain sky, the same constellations that had watched over her escape from the plantation. But everything else had changed. She was no longer alone, no longer without allies or hope. Somewhere behind them, Ezra was preparing for his own dangerous journey. Somewhere ahead, strangers were waiting to risk their lives for people they'd never met. United only by a shared belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice, the wagon rolled through the night, carrying its precious cargo toward an uncertain but hopeful future. And for the first time since her escape began, Celeste allowed herself to believe that her children might actually grow up free. Martha's voice drifted back from the driver's seat, soft and reassuring. "Not much farther now, dear. Samuel's got coffee brewing and a warm bed waiting. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you to the next station." The Underground Railroad was more than a network of routes and safe houses, Celeste realized. It was a community of conscience, a family bound not by blood, but by shared humanity. She and her children were part of that family now, protected by people who understood that some principles were worth dying for. The wagon continued its steady progress through the darkness, each mile bringing them closer to true freedom. Behind them, the mountains that had sheltered them faded into shadow. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous but full of possibility. In her arms, hope stirred and made a small sound, not quite a cry, but not quite contentment either. Freedom continued sleeping, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of complete trust. They were so young, so vulnerable, yet already they were freedom fighters, their very existence a rebellion against a system that would have claimed them as property. "Almost there," Martha called softly. "Almost safe." The words carried more than geographical meaning. They were a promise, a prayer, a statement of faith in the power of human goodness to triumph over evil. As the wagon rolled on through the night, Celeste held her children close and dared to hope that promise might actually come true. The Henderson grain mill sat beside a rushing creek like a sleeping giant, its massive wooden wheels silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Martha brought the wagon to a halt beside the building's weathered stone foundation. The the mules snorting softly in the cold air. Through the gaps in her hiding place, Celeste could see lamplight flickering in the windows of the house beyond, where someone was already awake despite the early hour. "Samuel's expecting us," Martha whispered as she helped Celeste emerge from the cramped compartment. "Been watching for our arrival since midnight." The babies had slept through most of the journey, lulled by the wagon's steady motion, but now they stirred as Celeste lifted them from their makeshift bed. Hope opened her eyes and gazed around with the alert curiosity that was becoming her trademark, while Freedom remained drowsy, content to nestle against his mother's shoulder. A tall figure emerged from the shadows near the mill house, moving with the cautious efficiency of someone accustomed to clandestine arrivals. Samuel Henderson was younger than Celeste had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man who earned his living through honest labor. But his eyes held the same quiet determination she'd seen in Ezra and the Weatherbays, the look of someone who'd chosen to stand against injustice regardless of the personal cost. "Welcome," he said simply, his voice warm despite the circumstances. "Mary's got breakfast ready and beds prepared. You must be exhausted." The mill house proved to be larger than it appeared from outside, with rooms that seemed to flow into each other in unexpected ways. Mary Henderson met them at the door, a woman whose gentle demeanor couldn't quite disguise the steel beneath. She took charge of the babies immediately, cooing over them with the practiced ease of someone who'd raised 5 children of her own. "Beautiful little ones," she murmured, settling Hope in her arms while Celeste held Freedom. "They look strong, healthy. You've done well caring for them under such difficult circumstances." The kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the smell of fresh bread and coffee. As Celeste sat at the scrubbed wooden table, she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in days. This was another sanctuary, another place where kindness existed alongside courage. "Martha told us about the situation," Samuel said as he poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs. "Federal marshals, increased patrols, rewards being offered. They're taking this seriously." "Too seriously," Mary added grimly. "Word is they're not just looking for Celeste anymore. They want Ezra too, for killing that bounty hunter." Celeste's blood chilled. "Killing?" But Ezra said the man was only wounded. "Samuel." And Mary exchanged glances. "Pierce died 2 days after the shooting," Samuel explained gently. "Internal bleeding," the doctor said. "Means Ezra's wanted for murder now, not just aiding fugitives." The implications hit Celeste like a physical blow. Ezra had risked everything to protect her and the babies, and now he was a wanted man himself. If captured, he'd face the gallows, all because he'd shown kindness to a desperate woman fleeing slavery. "He knew," she said quietly, understanding flooding through her. "When he said goodbye, he already knew what the consequences would be." "That's the kind of man he is," Martha said, settling beside Celeste at the table. "Willing to pay any price for what's right." The next 3 days passed in a strange mixture of peace and anxiety. The Henderson house was a masterpiece of hidden spaces and secret passages, built over decades to accommodate the steady stream of freedom seekers who passed through. Celeste and the babies stayed in a concealed room behind the kitchen pantry, accessible only through a panel that looked like part of the wall. Mary proved to be not just a gracious hostess but a skilled teacher as well. She showed Celeste how to move silently through unfamiliar houses, how to read the signs that indicated safe versus dangerous areas, how to calm crying babies in situations where silence meant survival. "The journey north gets more dangerous from here," Mary explained as they worked together preparing supplies for the next leg of the trip. "Bigger towns, more patrols, people who make their living hunting fugitives. You'll need every advantage you can get." Samuel spent his time gathering intelligence from the network of mill workers, farmers, and traders who passed through his operation. The news was increasingly worrisome. Federal marshals had indeed arrived in the area, led by Man named Colonel Marcus Thornfield, who'd built a reputation as a relentless pursuer of escaped slaves. Thornfield's methods were legendary for their ruthlessness. He used tracking dogs trained to attack, offered bounties that encouraged betrayal, and showed no mercy to anyone who aided fugitives. He's turned this into a personal crusade, Samuel reported during one of their evening strategy sessions. Claims that every escaped slave undermines the entire foundation of Southern society. He won't stop until he's captured Celeste and made an example of everyone who helped her. But there was also encouraging news. The Underground Railroad network was responding to the increased pressure by adapting their methods. New routes were being established, safe houses were improving their concealment, and conductors were sharing information faster than ever before. On the morning of the third day, as Celeste was feeding the babies in the hidden room, she heard horses approaching the mill. Her body tensed instinctively, but Mary's calm voice through the wall reassured her. "It's all right, dear. We've been expecting this visitor." The panel slid open to reveal not Samuel or Mary, but a figure that made Celeste's heart leap with relief and terror in equal measure. Ezra stood in the opening, but he looked different, thinner, more worn, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. "You made it," she whispered, wanting to run to him but conscious of the babies in her arms. "Barely," he admitted, stepping into the hidden room and closing the panel behind him. "They're everywhere, Celeste. Patrols on every road, checkpoints at every river crossing. I had to take routes that don't exist on any map." As he settled beside her, she could see the toll the journey had taken. His clothes were torn and dirty. His face bore scratches from thorns and branches, and his hands shook slightly from exhaustion. But his eyes were alive with determination, and when he looked at her and the babies, his expression softened with an emotion that made her heart race. "I thought I might not make it," he said quietly. "There were moments when I was sure they'd caught me, but you did make it. You're here." "I'm here," he agreed, reaching out to touch Hope's tiny hand. The baby's fingers closed around his, and, for a moment, the fugitive and the infant regarded each other with mutual fascination. Samuel peered through the panel, his face grave. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "All of us. The situation has changed." In the kitchen, Mary had spread maps across the table, marking routes and safe houses with different colored threads. The complexity of the network was staggering. Dozens of interconnected paths stretching from Virginia all the way to Canada, each one representing lives risked and sacrifices made. "Thornfield's changed his tactics," Samuel began, pointing to areas marked in red. "Instead of chasing you, he's getting ahead of you. He's positioning men at every known safe house between here and the Pennsylvania border." "He knows our routes?" Ezra asked, studying the map with growing concern. "Some of them. We suspect someone's been compromised, either captured and forced to talk, or bought with Thornfield's gold. Either way, the traditional paths are no longer safe." Mary pointed to a different section of the map where blue threads traced a winding path through seemingly empty wilderness. "There is another way," she said. "Longer, more dangerous, but completely outside the known network." The route she indicated led west instead of north, into the most remote regions of the Allegheny Mountains before curving back toward Pennsylvania. It would add weeks to their journey and take them through territory where a single mistake could mean death from exposure or wild animals. "It's never been used for a family group," Samuel admitted. "The physical demands are extreme, and there are long stretches with no safe houses, no supplies, no help if something goes wrong." "But Thornfield won't expect it," Ezra said, seeing the logic despite the risks. "He's focused on the established routes." "There's something else," Mary added hesitantly. "The western route passes through Cherokee territory. The relationship between the Cherokee and escaped slaves is complicated." Some tribes will help, others will turn you over to authorities for the bounty. The weight of the decision settled over the room like storm clouds. Stay with the known. Roots and risk capture by Thornfield's men, or venture into uncharted territory where survival itself became the primary challenge. What do you think? Celeste asked, looking at each face around the table. These people had already risked so much for her and the babies. Whatever decision they made would affect all of them. I think, said a new voice from the doorway, that you don't have as much choice as you'd like. Everyone turned to see Martha Weatherby entering the kitchen, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by urgent concern. Behind her came Jonas, his weathered face set in grim lines. They found your cabin, Ezra, Jonas said without preamble. Thornfield himself was there yesterday, going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. He knows about Samuel and Mary now. This place is compromised. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. The Henderson Mill, which had been a safe haven for countless freedom seekers over the years, was no longer secure. More than that, Samuel and Mary themselves were now in mortal danger. How long do we have? Samuel asked, already moving toward a chest where emergency supplies were stored. Hours, maybe less, Martha replied. We saw them setting up roadblocks on our way here. They're preparing to surround this whole area. The peaceful sanctuary erupted into controlled chaos as everyone moved with practiced efficiency. Mary gathered clothing and medical supplies while Samuel loaded weapons and ammunition. Martha prepared traveling food that could sustain them through long stretches without resupply. The babies, Celeste said, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were attempting. They're so young. How can we possibly? The same way their ancestors survived the Middle Passage, Mary said firmly, pausing in her preparations. To take Celeste's hands. The same way you survived plantation life and escaped through a blizzard. One breath at a time, one step at a time, one day at a time. Within an hour, they were ready to leave. The western route would require different preparations than the northern paths, warmer clothes for mountain winters, hunting gear for obtaining food, maps drawn from the memories of Cherokee guides who'd shared information with trusted allies. As they prepared to depart, Samuel pulled Ezra aside for a private conversation. Celeste couldn't hear their words, but she could see the intensity of their discussion, the grave expressions that suggested they were talking about possibilities too terrible to voice aloud. If something happens to me, Ezra said when he returned. To her side, Samuel knows people among the Cherokee. Not all of them are friendly to escaped slaves, but some remember that they're fighting the same enemy. He'll make sure you reach safety. Nothing's going to happen to you, Celeste said fiercely. We've come too far to lose each other now. But even as she spoke the words, she could hear horses in the distance, the sound growing closer. Thornfields. Men were approaching, and their time had run out. Go, Samuel said urgently, opening a door that led to the mill's loading platform. The creek will mask your scent from the dogs. Follow it upstream for 2 miles, then take the deer path toward Eagle's Peak. What about you and Mary? Celeste asked, but she already knew the answer from their expressions. Someone needs to slow them down, Mary said simply. Give you time to get away. The goodbyes were swift and heartbreaking. These people who'd welcomed them as family were staying behind to face capture or worse, all to give strangers a chance at freedom. As Celeste followed Ezra into the darkness beside the rushing creek, she carried with her not just her children, but the weight of sacrifices made by people whose names history would never remember. Behind them, the mill house blazed with sudden light as Thornfield's men surrounded it. Ahead lay the unknown wilderness, treacherous and unforgiving, but offering something the established routes no longer could. Hope. The sound of the creek covered their footsteps as they began the most dangerous phase of their journey toward freedom. In her arms, hope and freedom slept peacefully, trusting their parents to lead them safely through whatever darkness lay ahead. And somewhere in the mountains that stretched before them, all eyes they'd never met were preparing to risk everything for strangers they'd never see again. The Underground Railroad wasn't just a network of routes and safe houses. It was a testament to the power of human compassion to triumph over the forces of oppression. One step at a time, one breath at a time. They moved toward freedom. The Cherokee village appeared through the morning, mist like something from a half-remembered dream. After 2 weeks of following deer paths and sleeping in caves, after crossing streams that had no names and climbing ridges that touched the clouds, Celeste had begun to wonder if they would ever see human habitation again. Now as she crouched beside Ezra behind a fallen log, watching smoke rise from cooking fires and children play in a central clearing, she felt a mixture of hope and terror that made her hands shake. "Remember what Samuel told us," Ezra whispered, adjusting his grip on the pack that contained their few remaining supplies. "Not all Cherokee are friendly to escaped slaves, but Chief Sequoia has been known to show mercy to those fleeing bondage. We need to approach carefully, show respect, and hope his influence extends to this village." The babies had grown remarkably during their journey through the wilderness. Hope had developed a habit of staying alert during travel, her dark eyes taking in every detail of their surroundings as if she were memorizing the path to freedom. Freedom had become the quieter twin, content to sleep against his mother's chest during the long days of walking. But when he was awake, he observed everything with an intensity that sometimes unsettled Celeste. Their clothing bore the marks of hard travel-torn fabric, mud stains, patches sewn with thread salvaged from Ezra's emergency kit. Celeste's dress, once a respectable traveling outfit provided by Martha Weatherby, now looked like the garment of a refugee, which she supposed was exactly what it was. Ezra's beard had grown wild, and his eyes held the constant alertness of a hunted animal. But they were alive and they were together, and according to the map Samuel had given them, they were only 50 miles from the Pennsylvania border. 50 miles from territory where federal slave catchers had no legal authority, where Celeste and her children could begin building lives as free people, if they could convince the Cherokee to help them. "We go together," Ezra said, standing slowly, with his hands visible and empty. "Any sign of hostility, we retreat immediately. The baby's safety comes first." They emerged from the tree line walking slowly, their movements deliberate and non-threatening. Almost immediately, dogs began barking, and children stopped their games to stare at the strangers. Warriors appeared from seemingly nowhere, armed with rifles and traditional weapons. Forming a loose circle around the approaching fugitives, an elderly man emerged from the largest dwelling, his bearing suggesting authority despite his advanced years. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence and caution. He wore a mixture of traditional Cherokee clothing and European garments, a visual representation of a people caught between two worlds. "I am Running Bear," he said in English accented but clear. "What brings strangers to our village?" Ezra stepped forward slightly, keeping his hands visible. "I am Ezra Blackwood. This is Celeste and her children. We seek passage through Cherokee lands on our journey north. We come in peace and mean no harm to your people." Running Bear's gaze shifted to Celeste and the babies, and something in his expression softened. Perhaps it was the sight of the infants, or the obvious exhaustion of their mother, but the hostility in his stance diminished slightly. "You flee from slavery," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Celeste answered, finding her voice despite her fear. "My children were born free in the mountains, but the law still claims them as property. We seek a place where that law cannot reach." A murmur went through the gathered Cherokee, some nodding with understanding, others frowning with concern. Running Bear raised his hand for silence, then studied the small family with the careful attention of a man weighing a momentous decision. "There are those among the white men who would pay much gold for knowledge of your location," he said finally. "Federal marshals have been through here, offering rewards that would feed our village through a hard winter." Celeste's heart sank. If the Cherokee chose to turn them over to Thornfield's men, their journey would end here, in this peaceful clearing surrounded by mountains that had come to feel like prison walls. But Running Bear wasn't finished speaking. "There are also those among my people who remember when we too were hunted, when our children were taken and our families scattered. We remember the trail of tears when the white man's law forced us from our ancestral lands." His voice grew, harder, older, carrying the weight of historical trauma. "Some debts transcend gold." He gestured toward a woman standing near one of the dwellings. "Morning song will provide food and shelter while the council meets. We must discuss your request according to our traditions." The Cherokee Council convened in a large structure at the village's heart, while Celeste and Ezra waited in mourning. Song's home with growing anxiety. The Cherokee woman proved to be remarkably kind, offering them the first hot meal they'd eaten in days and clean water for washing. Her English was limited, but her gestures spoke clearly of compassion and understanding. "Your babies are strong," she said in halting English, examining hope and freedom with the expert eye of someone who'd raised many children. "They have the look of survivors." Through the dwelling's open doorway, they could hear the council's deliberations, voices rising and falling in passionate debate, sometimes in English but more often in Cherokee. Celeste caught fragments that made her stomach clench with worry. Federal marshals will return ... endangering the entire village ... double quotes, our own children to consider ... But there were other voices too, speaking with equal passion about honor and justice, about the obligations of the strong to protect the weak. The debate continued for hours, and with each passing minute, Celeste felt their chances slipping away. Finally, as the sun began to set, Running Bear appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, giving no hint of the council's decision. "The council has spoken," he said formally. "There are those who believe harboring fugitives brings danger to our people. They fear retribution from the federal marshals." Celeste's heart stopped. "But there are others who remember our own suffering, who understand that justice sometimes requires defying unjust laws. These voices have prevailed." Running Bear's stern expression cracked slightly, revealing the hint of a smile. "You may stay until you are rested and resupplied. When you are ready to continue your journey, our hunters will guide you safely to the Pennsylvania border." Relief flooded through Celeste so powerfully that she nearly collapsed. Ezra caught her arm, his own face showing the same overwhelming gratitude that left them both momentarily speechless. "Thank you," Celeste managed finally. "You're risking so much for strangers." "We risk much by doing nothing," Running Bear replied. "Evil flourishes when good people choose safety over justice. Our ancestors understood this. We honor their memory by helping those who flee from bondage." The next 3 days in the Cherokee village provided a respite Celeste hadn't dared to hope for. The children thrived in the warmth and security, growing visibly stronger with each day of regular meals and peaceful sleep. Morning Song and other Cherokee women delighted in caring for the babies, often taking turns holding them while Celeste rested or helped with village tasks. Ezra proved popular with the Cherokee men, sharing knowledge about hunting and tracking that impressed even experienced warriors. His skill with firearms and his understanding of military tactics made him a valuable ally in a region where tensions with white settlers remained high. But it was the babies who truly captured the village's heart. Hope's alertness and ready smiles charmed everyone she met, while Freedom's peaceful nature and watchful eyes reminded the Cherokee of their own prophecies about children born free who would help heal ancient wounds. "They are special, these little ones," Morning song told Celeste as they worked together preparing evening meals. Born in freedom, raised in struggle, destined for greatness. Our medicine man sees much wisdom in their eyes. On the third evening, a war party returned from scouting the surrounding territory with troubling news. Federal marshals had been spotted less than 10 miles away, systematically searching every valley and questioning every settler about escaped slaves. Thornfield leads them personally, reported Swift Eagle, the war party's leader. He has Cherokee. With him outcasts who have sold themselves to white gold. They know our ways, our hiding places. The village erupted in urgent discussion. Some Cherokee argued for turning the fugitives over immediately, claiming that protecting them would bring destruction to the entire community. Others insisted that surrendering to federal pressure would only encourage more intrusions into Cherokee territory. We could fight, suggested one young warrior. Drive them from our lands, and bring the full weight of the federal army down upon us? Running Bear shook his head. We are not yet ready for such a war. Then what do you suggest? Swift Eagle asked. Running Bear turned to Ezra, his weathered face thoughtful. You know these men who hunt you. How do they think? What do they expect? Ezra considered the question carefully. Thornfield is methodical, relentless. He'll search every possible hiding place, question every person who might have information. But he's also arrogant. He believes his authority gives him the right to do whatever he chooses. And this arrogance, could it be turned against him? A plan began to form in Ezra's mind, dangerous but possible. If we could convince him that we'd already moved on, that we'd never been here at all. A false trail, Swift Eagle said, understanding immediately. Leading away from the village, toward territory where Cherokee authority is absolute. It would require volunteers, Running Bear warned. Men willing to risk their lives to protect strangers. Without hesitation, a dozen Cherokee warriors stepped forward. These were men who'd grown up hearing stories of their people's forced removal from ancestral lands, who understood that resistance sometimes required sacrifice. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. A group of Cherokee warriors would create an obvious trail leading north toward the Canadian border, complete with signs of a family group traveling with infants. Meanwhile, other warriors would guide Celeste, Ezra, and the babies on a hidden path that would take them west before curving back toward Pennsylvania. The deception must be perfect, Running Bear emphasized as they finalized the details. If Thornfield suspects trickery, he will tear this village apart looking for the truth. The false trail party departed before dawn, taking with them items of clothing that Celeste and Ezra had worn during their stay in the village. They would leave an obvious path that any competent tracker could follow, leading Thornfield's men away from the real fugitives. 2 hours later, as the first federal scouts appeared on the ridge overlooking the village, Celeste and Ezra slipped away through a hidden canyon known only to Cherokee hunters. Their guides were Swift Eagle and 2 younger warriors, men who moved through the wilderness with the silent efficiency of shadows. The journey through Cherokee territory tested every skill they'd learned during their weeks in the wilderness. The paths were narrow and treacherous, winding through gorges where a single misstep could mean death. But their guides knew every rock and tree, every stream and cave, leading them safely through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate. Alone, on the second day, they heard gunfire echoing from the northern valleys, the sound of Thornfield's men engaging with the Cherokee decoy party. Swift Eagle listened to the distant shots with grim satisfaction. They have taken the bait, he said. My brothers will lead them far from here before melting back into the forests. By the time the Federals realize they have been deceived, you will be beyond their reach. The babies seemed to sense the tension of their situation, remaining unusually quiet during the day's travel and sleeping peacefully at night. Hope had developed a habit of studying faces intently, as if memorizing everyone who helped in their journey to freedom. Freedom continued to observe everything with those remarkably alert eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch the Cherokee warriors with tiny hands that seemed to bless their efforts. On the fourth day, Swift Eagle led them to a ridge that overlooked a broad valley stretching toward the horizon. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, they could see settlements that looked different from anything they'd encountered before. Neat farms with prosperous-looking buildings, roads that ran straight and true, fences that spoke of established prosperity rather than frontier survival. "Pennsylvania," Swift Eagle said simply. "The land where your chains have no power." Celeste stared at the distant valley, hardly daring to believe that their goal was finally within reach. After months of running, weeks of hiding, days of terror and exhaustion, freedom lay spread before them like a promised land. But even as hope surged in her heart, she knew their journey wasn't over. Crossing into Pennsylvania would provide legal protection from slave catchers, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental challenges of building new lives in a world that still saw her children as somehow less than fully human. "What will you do now?" Swift Eagle asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Live," Celeste said simply. "Raise my children. Show them that freedom is worth any price." Ezra moved beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Over the weeks of shared danger and hardship, their relationship had deepened into something neither had expected. Love forged in crisis, tested by fire, strengthened by mutual sacrifice. "We'll live," he corrected gently. "All of us together." The Cherokee warriors prepared to leave them at the Pennsylvania border, their mission complete. But Swift Eagle had one final gift, a bundle wrapped in deerskin that contained Cherokee-made clothing for the babies, beautifully crafted garments that would keep them warm through the coming winter. "For hope and freedom," he said formally. "So they will remember the Cherokee people who helped them find their way to safety." As the warriors disappeared back into the wilderness, Celeste and Ezra stood on the ridge overlooking their new homeland. Behind them lay months of terror and struggle, a trail marked by the kindness of strangers and the sacrifices of people who'd risked everything for justice. Ahead lay the unknown future, full of challenges and possibilities in equal measure. They would need to find work, establish a home, navigate a society that might be legally free, but wasn't necessarily welcoming to former slaves and their white allies. But they were together. They were alive. And in her arms, hope and freedom slept peacefully, breathing the air of liberty for the first time in their young lives. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the Pennsylvania Valley in all its promise. Somewhere in that landscape of farms and villages, they would build new lives as free people. One step at a time, one day at a time, they began their descent toward freedom. The town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, bustled with the energy of a community, built on honest labor and moral conviction. As Celeste walked down the main street carrying hope while Ezra held freedom, she marveled at the sight of black and white citizens conducting business together, children of different races playing in the same schoolyard, and most remarkably, families like theirs moving freely without fear or shame. It had been 6 months since they'd crossed the Pennsylvania border, and the transformation in their lives seemed almost miraculous. The terrified fugitives who'd fled through winter wilderness had become respected, members of a community that valued character over color, determination over birthright. Their first weeks in Lancaster had been challenging despite their legal freedom. Finding work proved difficult for a former slave and a wanted man, even in a state that had abolished slavery decades earlier. They'd survived on charity from Quaker families and slept in a church basement while searching for opportunities to build independent lives. The breakthrough came when Ezra's skills as a craftsman caught the attention of Jacob Zimmerman, a German immigrant who owned the town's largest furniture workshop. Zimmerman cared nothing for Ezra's past troubles with federal marshals. He needed skilled hands and paid fair wages for honest work. Within a month, Ezra had become the shop's most valued employee. his mountain-honed skills with wood and metal making him indispensable. Celeste found purpose working with the Ladies' Aid Society, an organization dedicated to helping newly arrived freedom seekers establish themselves in Lancaster County. Her own experience as a fugitive made her uniquely qualified to understand the fears and needs of people fleeing bondage. She counseled women who'd left children behind, helped families navigate the complexities of legal freedom, and gradually discovered that her calling lay in healing hearts as well as helping with practical necessities. But it was the babies who truly thrived in their new environment. Hope had grown into a toddler whose laughter filled their small apartment above Zimmerman's workshop, her curiosity about the world around her delighting everyone she met. Freedom remained the quieter twin, but his thoughtful nature and gentle spirit made him a favorite among the Quaker children who attended the integrated school they would both enter in a few years. The apartment itself reflected their journey from slavery to freedom. Simple furniture crafted by Ezra's own hands, quilts sewn by Celeste during long winter evenings, toys carved from scraps of wood. Everything spoke of lives built through honest effort rather than inherited privilege. It wasn't luxury, but it was theirs, earned through sacrifice and protected by law. On this particular autumn morning, they were walking to the weekly market when a familiar figure emerged from the crowd ahead. Martha Weatherby moved through the Lancaster farmers market with the same efficient energy she'd shown in the Virginia mountains, her gray hair now neatly pinned under a respectable bonnet, her mountain clothes replaced by the simple dress of a Pennsylvania farm wife. "Martha!" Celeste called out, her voice bright with joy. The reunion was warm and emotional, with Martha embracing both adults and making appropriate fuss over how much the babies had grown. "Jonas is here too," Martha explained as they found a quiet spot near the fountain in the town square. "We decided mountain life was too lonely after you folks left. Besides, there's good work here for people who know how to help freedom seekers find their way." The conversation that followed filled in gaps from the perilous journey they'd all shared. The Hendersons had survived Thornfield's raid, but been forced to abandon their mill and flee north. They settled in Philadelphia, where Samuel had found work with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, and Mary had returned to midwifery among the city's large community of former slaves. "What happened to Thornfield?" Ezra asked, his voice carrying the tension that still appeared whenever the colonel's name was mentioned. Martha's expression darkened. "Disgraced and dismissed from federal service. Seems the Cherokee led him on quite a chase through those mountains. By the time he realized he'd been tricked, word had gotten back to Washington about his methods. Even his supporters couldn't defend burning Cherokee villages and threatening children to get information. The news brought closure to a chapter of their lives that had remained painfully open. Thornfield's obsessive pursuit had ended in his own downfall, while those he'd hunted had found safety and prosperity in free territory. As they talked, other figures from their past appeared in the market crowd. Swift Eagle and two other Cherokee men moved among the vendors, trading furs and crafted goods for manufactured items they couldn't produce in their mountain villages. The reunion was joyful but brief. The Cherokee men were wary of staying too long in white settlements, even friendly ones. "The babies are strong," Swift Eagle observed, studying hope and freedom with the same intensity he'd once used to read animal tracks. "They will grow to be bridges between worlds, healers of old wounds." His words proved prophetic in ways none of them could have imagined. As the children grew, they naturally moved between the various communities that made up Lancaster County, playing with German immigrant children one day, learning traditional Cherokee games from visiting warriors the next, helping newly arrived freedom seekers feel welcome in their strange new world. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to their apartment. Celeste was teaching Hope to form letters on a slate board while Freedom napped in his cradle when footsteps echoed on the outside stairs. Ezra opened the door to reveal a young woman whose features immediately marked her as Cherokee, though Her clothing suggested someone who'd spent considerable time in white society. "I am Sarah Ridge," she said in perfect English. "My grandfather was a chief, my father a Cherokee diplomat. I represent a group that seeks to build connections between our people and those who have found freedom from slavery." Over the next hour, Sarah explained her mission. Progressive Cherokee leaders had recognized that the struggles of escaped slaves and displaced native peoples shared common elements. Both groups faced persecution from the same federal system. Both sought to preserve their children's futures. Against overwhelming odds, both understood that survival sometimes required adapting to new circumstances while maintaining essential identity. "We propose an alliance," Sarah continued. "Cherokee safe houses for freedom seekers traveling through our territory. Education programs that teach Cherokee children about the realities of slavery. Joint political action to oppose federal policies that threaten both our peoples." The idea was revolutionary, dangerous, and profoundly hopeful. It suggested possibilities for resistance and mutual aid that could transform the landscape of American injustice. "What would you need from us?" Celeste asked, recognizing that her own experience made her a potential bridge between communities. "Teachers," Sarah replied immediately. "People who understand both worlds, who can help Cherokee children learn why some humans are born free while others must fight for liberty. And advocates voices that can speak to white audiences about the humanity of all oppressed peoples." The conversation continued deep into the evening, exploring possibilities that seemed to expand with each exchange. By the time Sarah departed, they'd outlined plans for a school that would serve Cherokee children and the children of freedom seekers alike, teaching both groups the skills they'd need to thrive in a changing world. Winter brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. Ezra's reputation as a master craftsman spread throughout Lancaster County, bringing commissions for furniture and wooden sculptures that graced the homes of wealthy Quaker families. His success enabled them to move to a larger apartment and begin saving money for the house they planned to build on the outskirts of town. Celeste's work with the Ladies' Aid Society expanded as word spread about her unique combination of personal experience and natural counseling ability. Women who'd suffered under slavery found in her someone who truly understood their trauma, while her growing education in letters and arithmetic made her an effective advocate in dealing with legal and business matters. But it was the children who provided the greatest joy and the deepest sense of purpose. Hope celebrated her second birthday with a party that included children from every community in Lancaster County, Quaker and Lutheran, German and Irish, African American and Cherokee. Her ability to move effortlessly between different cultural groups seemed to embody the future they were all working to create. Freedom remained quieter but no less remarkable. At 18 months, he showed an uncanny ability to sense when adults were troubled, often offering comfort through simple gestures that seemed wise beyond his years. The Cherokee visitors always paid special attention to him, claiming they saw the marks of a future medicine man in his careful observations of the world around him. Spring brought news that would reshape their understanding of what freedom truly meant. A letter arrived from Canada bearing the seal of the colonial government and addressed to the family of Celeste and Ezra Blackwood. The formal recognition of their union, they'd married the previous autumn in a simple Quaker ceremony, came with an offer that took their breath away. The Canadian government, seeking to populate its vast territories with skilled settlers, was offering land grants to American refugees who could demonstrate useful abilities and moral character. The letter specifically mentioned Ezra's carpentry skills and Celeste's work with displaced persons as qualifications that made them desirable immigrants. 200 acres in Ontario, Ezra read aloud, his voice filled with wonder. Free and clear, with assistance for the first year's provisions and tools for farming. The opportunity represented something neither had dared to dream, not just legal freedom, but the chance to build a legacy for their children on land they would actually own. It would mean leaving the community that had nurtured them, but it also meant complete escape from any possibility of re-enslavement should political winds shift in the United States. The decision sparked intense discussions that lasted for weeks. They consulted with friends, sought advice from Quaker elders, and prayed for guidance. The Cherokee visitors were particularly enthusiastic about the Canadian option, explaining that their own people had found more respectful treatment from British colonial officials than from American authorities. In Canada, Sarah Ridge explained during one of her visits, Indigenous peoples and former slaves live under the same Crown protections. The law sees you as subjects rather than problems, to be managed. The turning point came when Hope, now walking confidently and beginning to form simple sentences, made an observation that cut straight to the heart of their dilemma. Playing with her collection of wooden animals, all carved by Ezra during quiet evenings, she held up a bear and a deer and announced, "They are friends now. No more scary." The simple statement crystallized what they'd both been feeling. In Pennsylvania, they would always be former slaves and a former fugitive, defined by what they'd escaped rather than what they were building. In Canada, they could simply be farmers, parents, citizens contributing to a growing community. The preparations for departure took months of careful planning. Ezra completed all his outstanding commissions, ensuring that his reputation for reliability remained intact. Celeste worked to establish systems that would allow the Ladies' Aid Society to continue helping newcomers without her direct involvement. Most challenging was saying goodbye to the community that had given them their first taste of true freedom. The farewell party, organized by their Quaker friends, filled the largest hall in Lancaster, with guests representing every group that had touched their lives since arriving in Pennsylvania. Martha and Jonas presented them with a hand-drawn map, showing safe houses and friendly contacts along the route to Canada. "Just in case you need help along the way," Martha said with the practical wisdom that had served them so well in the mountains. The Cherokee delegation, led by Sarah Ridge, offered something even more precious: adoption into the tribal family structure that would make them honorary Cherokee wherever they traveled. The ceremony was simple but profound, marking their transformation from refugees seeking aid to allies committed to mutual support. "Your children will always have a place among our people," Sarah declared as she placed traditional Cherokee necklaces around Hope and Freedom's necks. "They are bridges between worlds, and bridges must be protected by all who wish to cross safely." The journey to Canada proved remarkably peaceful compared to their earlier flight from slavery. Traveling openly with proper documents, staying in legitimate inns, moving without fear of pursuit, it felt almost surreal after months of running and hiding. At the border crossing, the British official who examined their papers was courteous and welcoming. "Another family seeking opportunity in Her Majesty's dominions," he observed with approval. "You'll find good land and honest neighbors waiting for you." The land grant was everything the government letter had promised and more. Rolling hills, perfect for farming, a creek that never ran dry, forests that would provide timber for building and fuel for heating. Most importantly, it was theirs legally, permanently, without qualification or condition. Building their homestead became a community effort that demonstrated how much their lives had changed. Neighbors they'd never met arrived with tools and materials, offering labor and expertise without expectation of payment. These were people who understood that prosperity came through mutual aid rather than individual competition. The house that rose from their Canadian hillside reflected everything they'd learned about survival and hope. Strong foundations dug deep into rocky soil, walls built to withstand the harshest winters, windows positioned to capture every available ray of sunshine. It was modest but solid, a home built for generations rather than seasons. As they stood on their porch on the evening they moved into the completed house, watching Hope and Freedom play in the yard while the sun set over land they actually owned, Celeste reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. From a plantation slave cabin to a mountain hermit's refuge. From Cherokee villages to Pennsylvania safe houses. From desperate flight to prosperous settlement. Every step had been guided by people who chose compassion over safety, justice over law, hope over fear. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Ezra as they watched their children discover the joy of owning space they could explore without fear. "Leave in your mountain solitude, getting involved in our troubles?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The only thing I regret," he said finally, "is that it took me so long to understand that some kinds of solitude are just another form of slavery. Real freedom isn't something you can achieve alone, it's something you build together." The truth of his observation echoed in everything around them. Their freedom hadn't been won through individual effort, but through the collective action of dozens of people who'd risked everything to help strangers find safety. The Underground Railroad wasn't just a network of routes and hiding places. It was a testament to humanity's capacity for redemption through sacrifice. As night fell over their Canadian homestead, Celeste nursed freedom while hope fell asleep against Ezra's shoulder. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary challenges of farming and parenting, the daily work of building prosperity from honest effort. But tonight, surrounded by the peace they'd earned through struggle and the love they'd found. In darkness, they were simply a family. Free, safe, and bound together by something stronger than law or custom or fear. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs to the stars. But the sound no longer carried threat, it was simply part of the wilderness, symphony that had always marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. Between the lives they'd left behind and the future they were creating together. Hope and freedom would grow up as Canadians, as free citizens whose only chains would be those they chose to accept. They would learn about their parents' journey, not as their own burden, but as their inheritance proof that courage and love could triumph over any form of oppression. And someday, when they were old enough to understand, they would carry forward the lessons learned on snowy mountains and hidden trails, that freedom is never truly free until it belongs to everyone, and that the greatest victories are won not through violence but through the simple decision to help strangers become family. The Underground Railroad had delivered them safely to freedom's shore. Now it was their turn to extend the ladder to others still climbing toward the light. Years flowed by, like the creek that bordered their Canadian homestead, each season bringing new growth and deeper roots. Hope blossomed into a spirited 6-year-old, whose curiosity about the world seemed boundless. She could speak 3 languages: English from her parents, German from their Mennonite neighbors, and Cherokee phrases learned from visiting tribal members who stopped by their farm during trading journeys. Her favorite pastime was collecting stories from every traveler who passed through, building a mental library of adventures that spanned continents. Freedom, now 5, had developed into exactly the thoughtful soul his infant behavior had predicted. He spent hours observing insects in their garden, tracking animal movements through the forest, and asking questions that revealed wisdom far beyond his years. The Cherokee visitors always sought him out specifically, claiming his spirit carried ancient knowledge that would serve him well as he grew into manhood. Their farm had prospered beyond their wildest dreams. Ezra's carpentry skills, combined with his understanding of mountain agriculture, had created a homestead that other settlers used as a model for success. Their fields produced abundant crops of wheat and corn. Their livestock provided meat and dairy products for the growing community, and Ezra's furniture workshop in the barn created pieces that were shipped as far as Toronto and Montreal. But material success was only part of their story. The farmhouse had become an unofficial stop on the northern extension of the Underground Railroad, as word spread among freedom seekers that the Blackwood family offered both practical assistance and deep understanding of the refugee experience. Celeste had established a network of contacts throughout Ontario, connecting newcomers with employment opportunities, legal assistance, and the emotional support necessary for rebuilding lives after trauma. The challenges they faced were different from their early struggles, but no less significant. Building trust within established Canadian communities required patience and persistence, as many settlers viewed Americans with suspicion, regardless of their reasons for emigrating. Language barriers complicated business relationships, and cultural differences sometimes led to misunderstandings that took months to resolve. Most challenging was helping their children understand their unique position as bridges between worlds. Hope and freedom were Canadian citizens by birth, with legal protections their parents had never enjoyed. But they also carried the legacy of slavery and escape that marked them as different from their peers, teaching them pride in their heritage, while preparing them for a world that might judge them harshly required delicate balance and constant vigilance. The solution came through the school they established in partnership with Sarah Ridge's Cherokee Education Initiative. The log building that rose on the hill behind their farmhouse served children from multiple communities, Canadian-born offspring of freedom seekers, Cherokee youth whose families had moved north to escape American pressure, and local settler children whose parents valued integrated education over racial segregation. Celeste discovered her calling as an educator, developing a curriculum that taught practical skills alongside moral principles. Reading and arithmetic were essential, but equally important were lessons about justice, compassion, and the responsibility that came with freedom. Her classroom became a place where children learned to see differences as strengths rather than divisions. The school's success attracted attention from government officials in Toronto, who were experimenting with policies designed to integrate diverse populations into Canadian society. A visit from the provincial education minister resulted in official recognition and funding that allowed them to expand their program and train other teachers for similar schools throughout Ontario. But the most meaningful validation came from the children themselves. Students who graduated from their school went on to become leaders in their communities, doctors and lawyers, farmers and craftsmen, ministers and teachers who carried forward the values they'd learned in that hilltop classroom. They understood that education was not just about personal advancement, but about lifting entire communities toward prosperity and justice. That winter evenings in the farmhouse were filled with the sounds of learning and laughter. Hope would read aloud from books that arrived in packages from Philadelphia and New York, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passage. Freedom preferred working with his hands, carving small animals that told stories about forest wisdom and animal spirits he'd learned from Cherokee elders. Ezra spent those quiet hours writing in leather-bound journals, documenting everything they'd learned about farming in Canadian soil, recording techniques for building homes that could withstand brutal winters, and preserving the stories of everyone who'd helped them reach freedom. These volumes would become treasured family heirlooms, passed down through generations as testimony to the courage of ordinary people who chose extraordinary risks for the sake of justice. Celeste's evenings were devoted to correspondence that stretched across 2 countries. Letters arrived regularly from Martha and Jonas, now operating a farm in southern Ontario where they continued helping freedom seekers establish new lives. The Hendersons wrote from Philadelphia, where their work with the Anti-Slavery Society had expanded into a comprehensive program serving thousands of former slaves annually. Most precious were the letters from Cherokee communities scattered across multiple states and territories. Sarah Ridge had become a prominent voice in tribal politics, advocating for policies that recognized common interests between Indigenous peoples and escaped slaves. Her letters described alliance-building efforts that were creating unprecedented cooperation between historically separated communities. The correspondence network served purposes beyond personal connection. Information about safe routes, dangerous areas, and friendly contacts flowed through these letters, updating the knowledge base that kept the Underground Railroad functioning effectively. When political situations changed or new threats emerged, word spread quickly through channels that connected Canadian farms to Cherokee villages to Quaker meeting houses to secret rooms in city basements. Spring of their 7th year in Canada brought news that changed everything they thought they understood about their journey to freedom. A letter arrived bearing official seals in formal language that took several readings to comprehend fully. The British Parliament, responding to growing international pressure against slavery, had passed legislation making it illegal for any person to be returned to bondage from Canadian soil, regardless of their legal status in other countries. Implications were staggering. Every escaped slave who had ever feared recapture while living in Canada was now permanently, legally, irrevocably free. The Underground Railroad's northern terminus had become truly the end of the line, a place where freedom was not just hoped for, but guaranteed by international law. Celebrations spread through communities of former slaves across Ontario as word of the new legislation reached every corner of the province. Church services became festivals of gratitude. School assemblies turned into history lessons about the power of persistence. And family gatherings evolved into planning sessions for relatives still trapped in bondage who could now be brought north without fear. For Celeste and Ezra, the news brought closure to fears that had haunted their dreams for years. No federal marshal could ever again threaten their children's freedom. No change in American politics could force them back into slavery. No legal technicality could separate their family or steal their hard-won prosperity. But the legislation also brought new responsibilities. As among the most established and successful former slaves in their region, they found themselves looking for leadership in addressing challenges that came with permanent security. How should they respond to increased numbers of freedom seekers arriving with nothing but hope? What obligations did free people have toward those still in bondage? How could they best use their influence to create lasting change? The answers emerged through community discussions that lasted months and involved voices from every segment of their diverse neighborhood. The consensus that developed emphasized education, economic development, and political engagement as the foundations for building a society where freedom meant more than just absence of chains. Their school expanded again, this time adding vocational training programs that taught trades and professions necessary for economic independence. Graduates learned not just reading and writing, but also carpentry, farming, business management, and legal advocacy. The goal was creating leaders who could return to their communities with skills necessary for lifting others toward prosperity. Economic initiatives followed educational expansion. Celeste organized cooperatives that allowed small farmers to pool resources for purchasing equipment and marketing crops. Ezra established apprenticeship programs that taught advanced woodworking techniques to young men who could then start their own businesses. Community credit unions provided loans for families wanting to purchase land or establish enterprises. Political engagement proved more challenging but equally important. Canadian politics operated differently from American systems, with more emphasis on community consensus and less on individual ambition. Learning to navigate these differences required patience and careful observation, but gradually, former slaves began winning elected positions in local government and appointed roles in provincial administration. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Communities that had once focused solely on survival were now discussing taxation policies, infrastructure development, and international trade relationships. Former slaves who had once hidden in root cellars were now debating legislative proposals. In provincial assemblies, their children grew up taking these opportunities for granted, which was exactly what their parents had hoped. Hope announced at age 10 that she intended to become a doctor, inspired by stories of women physicians she'd read about in medical journals that arrived from Montreal. Freedom declared his intention to study law, motivated by Cherokee friends, who described the need for advocates who understood both Indigenous and refugee experiences. Neither child showed any inclination to limit their ambitions. based on their parents' history. They understood that they were the children of extraordinary people who had overcome impossible odds, but they also knew that their own lives would be measured by their contributions to future generations rather than their inheritance from the past. Summer brought visitors whose presence reminded everyone how far they'd traveled from those desperate days of flight through winter wilderness. Running Bear arrived with a delegation of Cherokee leaders who were exploring opportunities for establishing permanent communities in Canadian territory. The elderly chief had aged considerably since their first meeting, but his eyes still held the wisdom and determination that had saved their lives years earlier. "You have built something beautiful here," he observed, watching Hope and Freedom play with Cherokee children in the yard behind the school building. "These young ones are the future we dreamed of when we helped you find your way to safety." The visit concluded with ceremonies that formally recognized the bonds forged during their escape journey. Hope and Freedom received Cherokee names that acknowledged their roles as bridge builders and peacemakers. Celeste and Ezra were honored as adoptive parents to the entire Cherokee nation, with responsibilities and privileges that would last throughout their lives. As autumn painted the Canadian hills in brilliant colors, Celeste stood in her garden, harvesting vegetables that would feed her family through another winter. The abundance around her, pumpkins and squash, beans and corn, herbs for cooking and healing, represented security that once seemed impossible to achieve. But the garden also represented something more profound, the knowledge that freedom required constant cultivation. Like the soil that needed annual attention to produce healthy crops, liberty demanded ongoing effort from everyone who benefited from its protection. The children who played among the harvest vegetables would inherit a world dramatically different from the one their parents had known. They would face challenges their parents couldn't imagine, and opportunities that previous generations couldn't have dreamed. But they would face those challenges as free people, with tools and knowledge and community support that had been built through sacrifice and maintained through vigilance. As winter settled over their Canadian homestead once again, the Blackwood family gathered around their fireplace for evening readings that had become treasured tradition. Tonight, Hope read from a letter that had arrived from the Cherokee Nation, describing plans for a great council that would bring together representatives from tribes across multiple territories. Freedom added his own contribution by showing the wooden sculpture he'd been carving, a family of bears walking together through a forest, their path lit by stars that guided them safely home. The piece captured something essential about their journey, the understanding that freedom was not a destination but a way of traveling, not a place but a perspective, not an achievement but an ongoing commitment. Ezra closed the evening by reading from his journal entries about their early days in Canada, reminding everyone of the helpers who had made their current prosperity possible. Each name he mentioned represented lives risked for the sake of strangers, sacrifices made for principles rather than profit, choices that proved humanity's capacity for redemption through love. Outside, snow began falling softly on the land they owned, the house they had built, the dreams they had turned into reality. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary challenges of farming and teaching, parenting and community building. But tonight, they were simply a family gathered around the warmth they had created together, surrounded by the freedom they had earned through courage and maintained through commitment to helping others find their own paths to safety. The Underground Railroad had delivered them to this moment of peace, but the railroad itself continued operating, carrying new generations of freedom seekers toward new horizons of possibility. Hope and Freedom would inherit not just the prosperity their parents had built, but also the obligation to extend that ladder of opportunity to whoever needed help climbing toward the light. In the dancing flames of their fireplace, Celeste could see reflections of all the fires that had warmed them during their journey to freedom. Ezra's mountain cabin, the Henderson Mill, Cherokee Village gathering places, Pennsylvania farmhouses, and now this Canadian hearth where their children's children would someday tells stories about the winter night when a pregnant slave girl escaped into the snow and found not just safety, but the beginning of a legacy that would last for generations. 10th anniversary of their arrival in Canada marked a transformation that even their most optimistic dreams had never envisioned. What had begun as a desperate flight from bondage had evolved into a movement that was reshaping the entire region's approach to freedom, education, and community building. Their farm had become the unofficial headquarters for a network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the maritime provinces, connecting former slaves, indigenous peoples, and progressive settlers in common cause. The success of their integrated school had inspired similar institutions across Ontario, creating an educational system that challenged traditional assumptions about race and capability. Government officials from as far away as England visited their hilltop classroom, studying methods that seemed to produce remarkable results with minimal resources. The secret, Celeste explained to these distinguished visitors, lay not in revolutionary techniques, but in the simple recognition that all children possessed infinite potential when treated with respect and given genuine opportunity. Hope, now approaching her teens, had indeed begun preparing for medical studies with a determination that amazed her teachers. She spent afternoons apprenticed to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the region's only female physician, learning anatomy and pharmacology alongside traditional healing methods taught by Cherokee medicine women. Her notebooks contained detailed drawings of plant medicines and surgical procedures, annotated in 3 languages and organized with scientific precision that impressed even skeptical professors from Toronto's Medical College. Freedom had developed into exactly the bridge builder that Cherokee prophecies had predicted. At 12, he moved effortlessly between cultures, translating not just languages but entire worldviews for people struggling to understand each other across racial and cultural divides. His legal studies focused on developing frameworks that could protect indigenous rights while ensuring that former slaves maintained their hard-won freedoms. Letters arrived regularly from tribal leaders and abolitionist organizations seeking his insights on complex questions of justice and sovereignty. The children's accomplishments represented more than individual success. They embodied proof that freedom could reproduce itself, that liberation was not just escape from oppression, but the foundation for building better worlds. Every scholarship Hope earned and every legal precedent Freedom studied demonstrated that the sacrifices made by Underground Railroad conductors had produced returns that would compound across generations. But perhaps the most significant development was the arrival of Celeste's sister, Ruth, whose escape from the Whitmore plantation the previous spring had required assistance from networks that now spanned multiple countries. Ruth's journey north had taken 6 months and involved dozens of helpers, but it had also revealed how much the Underground Railroad had evolved since Celeste's desperate flight 12 years earlier. Where Celeste had faced winter wilderness with nothing but courage and hope, Ruth had traveled through established stations equipped with medical care, legal documentation, and financial support. Where Celeste had depended on chance encounters with sympathetic strangers, Ruth had been guided by professional conductors who moved freedom seekers with the efficiency of a commercial transportation system. The reunion between sisters who had never expected to see each other again provided emotional closure that completed Celeste's transformation from refugee to leader. Ruth's stories about conditions on the plantation confirmed that their escape had been not just personally necessary but morally imperative. Master Whitmore had died of liver disease brought on by drinking, but his widow had proven even more cruel, selling children away from parents and working field hands until they collapsed from exhaustion. "You saved more than yourself when you ran," Ruth told her sister as they worked together in the garden that fed their extended household. "Your escape inspired others." Word spread about the pregnant woman who disappeared into the snow and was never caught. People started believing that freedom was possible. Ruth's presence added new dimensions to their household and their mission. She brought skills in textile production that enabled them to establish a weaving cooperative employing women throughout the district. Her knowledge of plantation agriculture helped improve crop yields on local farms. Most importantly, her recent experience with slavery provided fresh perspectives on the challenges facing newly arrived freedom seekers. The economic impact of their various enterprises had transformed the entire region's prosperity. The furniture workshop now employed 15 craftsmen producing goods that were shipped throughout the British Empire. The weaving cooperative provided income for over 30 families, while producing textiles that competed favorably with factory-made alternatives. The school had become a teacher training center that supplied educators for communities across Canada and the northern United States. But success brought new challenges that tested everything they had learned about leadership and community building. Prosperity attracted attention from politicians and business leaders, who saw opportunities for personal gain rather than collective advancement. Immigration policies were being debated in Parliament, with some members arguing that Canada was accepting too many American refugees regardless of their circumstances. More troubling were signs that some former slaves, having achieved economic security, were losing interest in helping others still struggling for freedom. The comfortable middle-class existence that prosperity made possible seemed to diminish empathy for people whose situations remained desperate. Celeste found herself increasingly focused on preserving the values that had made their success possible, while adapting strategies to meet changing circumstances. The solution emerged through conversations with tribal elders who had faced similar challenges as their own communities grew prosperous and influential. Cherokee wisdom emphasized circular, rather than linear thinking. Success was not an endpoint, but a beginning. Not individual achievement, but collective responsibility. True prosperity required ensuring that benefits reached everyone in the community, including those not yet born. These discussions led to the establishment of the Freedom Foundation, an organization dedicated to preserving Underground Railroad history while supporting contemporary liberation movements. The foundation collected testimonies from conductors and freedom seekers, documented routes in safe houses, and maintained networks that could be activated quickly when political situations changed. More practically, the foundation provided scholarships for education, loans for business development, and legal assistance for people facing discrimination. It lobbied government officials for policies that protected refugee rights and worked with religious organizations to maintain safe houses for people still fleeing oppression in various forms. The foundation's first major test came when federal marshals from the United States attempted to extradite 3 freedom seekers who had been accused of theft charges that everyone understood were fabricated to justify re-enslavement. The legal battle that ensued established precedents that strengthened Canadian sovereignty, while demonstrating that former slaves could successfully challenge even federal authority when they possessed adequate resources and skilled representation. Victory, in that case, marked a turning point in how Canadian society viewed its refugee populations. No longer were former slaves seen as charity cases requiring assistance. They were recognized as contributing citizens whose success strengthened the entire nation. The political influence that followed enabled them to advocate effectively for other marginalized groups, creating coalitions that proved more powerful than any single community could manage alone. As winter deepened around their prosperous homestead, the Blackwood family prepared for Christmas celebrations that would include guests from across North America. Cherokee delegations would arrive from multiple reservations. Underground Rail veterans would gather from throughout the Great Lakes region, and government officials would attend representing both Canadian and British interests in refugee resettlement policies. But the most meaningful aspect of their holiday preparations was the tradition they had developed of reading letters from people they had helped reach freedom over the years. These testimonies, arriving from all corners of the continent, provided evidence that their sacrifices had produced results beyond anything they could have measured in personal terms. A Letter from Boston described a medical practice established by a former slave who had learned to read in their school. News from California told of gold mines operated cooperatively by Cherokee and African American partners who had met in their farmhouse kitchen. Reports from Mexico detailed communities where indigenous peoples and escaped slaves were creating new forms of society based on principles of mutual respect and shared prosperity. Each letter represented lives transformed, families reunited, children educated, and dreams realized through the network of assistance that had grown from their desperate escape through winter wilderness. The pregnant slave girl who had fled into the snow had become the grandmother of a movement that was reshaping an entire continent's understanding of freedom, justice, and human possibility. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently on their Canadian homestead and guests from dozens of communities gathered around their expanded dinner table, Celeste offered a prayer that acknowledged not just their blessings, but their obligations. They had been given so much safety, prosperity, family, community, influence, not for their own sake, but for the sake of everyone still climbing toward the light. The Underground Railroad had delivered them to freedom, but freedom itself had delivered them to purpose larger than their individual lives. Hope and freedom would inherit this understanding along with their material prosperity, carrying forward the knowledge that true security came only when everyone possessed the opportunity to build lives worthy of human dignity. Outside, the winter winds sang through trees that had witnessed their entire journey from desperate refugees to community leaders. But tonight, that wind carried no threat, only the promise that somewhere in the darkness, other families were still traveling toward safety, guided by stars and sustained by hope, following paths that had been cleared by people who understood that freedom was not a destination, but a gift that could only be kept by giving it away. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.